If you haven't already, go ahead and download the files at this link because you will need them in order to complete today's project. Today we're going to be going over MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. It's a design model that we use whenever we're creating apps in Xcode. It's the one recommended by Apple in case you're curious. But just let me know whenever you have this link.
Yeah. So while you're doing that, we had a meeting at Marston this week. If you wanted to just come and ask about iOS stuff, we're gonna have one next week too. Just gonna be a room in Marston. You can walk in, come talk to us. It'll be on Facebook.
Yeah. Office hours.
Yeah, office hours. I'm not closing the door.
Yeah. How many of you guys are ready? Good. All right. So, MVC design model, as I said. So, MVC consists of three things. We have our models, we have the view, and we have the controller. I'll give you a basic overview, but models are things that it's like a blueprint, right? So if we're making a house, the models would be the blueprint for our house, okay? The view is what we see, so we see the house. And the controller is like everything that makes the house work. Does that make sense? Very cool. So yeah, actually I should go back. We'll talk about this chart right here. So the controller is going to handle the majority of the communication in your app. So, for example, let's say we want to display a set of numbers. The controller might retrieve a set of numbers from the model and then send that set of numbers to the view. But it's very important, you don't want to have the model directly send that set of numbers to the view, because in larger scale projects, that's going to become very, very messy and hard to debug and sort of figure out what's wrong if something wrong happens. So big thing to take away is controller communicates with everything, and model and view should not communicate with each other. So as I said before, the model is sort of like where you get most of your information from. So an example of this would be your classes. How many of you have taken or are taking a computer programming class? Okay, good. So if you're familiar with classes, that's sort of like a blueprint, like I said. So those are generally going to be what your model is, or models. You can have more than one model for each MVC set, and we'll talk more about that later. Next thing is your view. This is what you actually see. So your view is going to take stuff that it receives from the controller and display it to the user. You can think of the view as one screen. So if you're on Snapchat, let's say, one view would be the camera screen, okay? And then you have separate views for the other two screens. And yeah, we'll get into that. Controller communicates between the model and the view. You shouldn't necessarily do a lot of data in the controller. You want to leave that to the model, if that makes sense. Any questions so far? That was kind of quick. So MVC, that's one thing. For each screen, we're going to have a separate model, view, and controller set. So we'll go back to the Snapchat example. On the camera screen, your models could be like all the processing for the images and actually taking a picture. Your controller would be like calling a function if you tap on a button. Like if you tap on the camera button, the controller would then communicate that to either the model or the view or both. And then your view is obviously the screen and all the things that make up that screen. And then that's one set of MVC. That's the camera screen. If you go to the next screen, we'll say the screen with your list of people on it. That's a separate MVC. And so to communicate, if you want to communicate between those two screens, you're going to use the controller of each MVC to do that communication. The controller does the bulk of communication for essentially everything. Questions? All right, good. We're just gonna dive into the project then. So go ahead and open up Xcode. And we're gonna create a new project. It's just gonna be single view, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm gonna call it meeting 3. All right, so I'll go ahead and show you what we're trying to make. All right, so this is what we're going to make today. It's relatively simple. It's just going to be an application that runs through a list of memes, and you can rate them, and it'll tell you a score, then like a little description, like this is a just meme. It'll display the image, and you can set a new score for it. And based on that new score, the description could change to like, oh, this meme is dead. That type of deal. So, you know, just it goes through memes. You can set a new score and it'll change that. So, to get started, we're practicing MVC. So, we're going to start by creating 3 folders: the model, the view, and the controller folders. So, you do new group. I'll call this one model. View, and controller. So if we click on our storyboard, this is going to be our view. So we already have a view, so we can drag that into the view folder. And that's what we're going to be using as our view for this project. Now, we haven't created any models yet, so we don't have to put anything in there yet. But we also have a view controller, and this is going to be the controller for this project. So we can drag that into the controller folder. Is everyone good so far?
Can you guys see it too?
Oh yeah, you guys see the code and stuff? Yeah, you always like command plus a little bit, not like command equals, you want to zoom in a little bit.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to start with creating the view. If we look at what we're trying to make, we have a title right here. This is a meme review application. That's the title of our application. Then we have the name of our meme. We have a description, or like I called it a level. We have our score. We have the image. We have a new score label. We have this little slider, which is glitching out for some reason, but
Just classic simulator.
yeah. And then we have our button at the bottom. So we're gonna sort of map out all of those in the storyboard. So for all of our text, we're gonna be using labels. So if you go up here, this is our object library, and we can, scroll through or type in stuff and then drag and drop that into our storyboard. So I'm not going to type out anything yet, but we're just gonna do a basic layout and mirror what we see on the right. So this label will be our title. And you can go in here and drag and drop another label.
Hello.
Hi.
Is this software engineering?
No.
Oh, this is iOS development club.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Is it part of the software, like engineering, or not? Like, if you're a beginner, are you able to, like, join?
Yeah, of course.
Like, okay,
Yeah.
alright, just making sure.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have another label for our meme name, and I'm just going to Command C, Command V, and duplicate this label. So again, we have our title, our name, our sort of description. There's our score. And then next we want the image. So move this over. Drag and drop an image view, and this just displays an image to the screen. So we do that. I'm gonna grab another label for the new score. And then this thing is exactly what it looks like. It's called a slider. So if we go into library and type in slider, there it is. Drag and drop. And last but not least, the button. Go ahead and put that on there. Now, if we run this right now, you can see we're developing on a screen that's an iPhone 8 screen. And you can see that down here. If we run this in the iPhone XR, it's not going to look the same. And the reason for that is we haven't set up constraints yet. And constraints is sort of what allows you to maintain the same look of your app on different screen sizes, because not every phone is going to have the same size screen. So you can see, yeah, it's all in this top left section of the screen because we haven't set up any constraints. So we're going to go ahead and set up some constraints. We'll start with the image view. We want this image view to be in the exact center of our app. So to do that, we can do center horizontally and vertically. That's clicking down here by this sideways bar graph looking icon. Click horizontally in container, vertically in container. And then you're going to add those constraints. And nothing is going to happen yet. We also want to define a size for this image view. So if you go to this little box looking thing right here and click on that, you can see we have this new constraint menu. If you click on these constraints, this is the distance away from the left and the right sides of the screen. So no matter what screen we're on, we want this image view to be, say, 60 units away from the left and 60 units away from the right. And that will stretch the image to make sure it fulfills those constraints. And while we're at it, we want this image to be a perfect square. So we're going to do an aspect ratio to do that. We'll go ahead and add these constraints. And you'll notice at first, this is definitely not a perfect square. You also notice these other elements are kind of messed up, but we'll worry about those later. To fix the aspect ratio, we're going to go click on our ruler over here. So if you click on image and then click on this ruler, you're going to be able to see all the constraints that we've applied. If you notice, our aspect ratio is 15:8 because when we first created our image view, that's what the aspect ratio was. So we want to change that to be 1:1. And that gets us our perfect square. So that's really all we have to do for the image view. Next, we'll go with the title. So this is the title of our app. We'll say we want this to be 40 units away from the top of the screen. So we'll add that constraint. And we also want this to be centered horizontally. So we'll add a constraint for horizontal center like we did for image view. And that's really all we need for the title. Next, we'll do this name. So the other thing we can do with these little constraints is we can set it away a distance from the closest object in that screen. So you can see right now it's setting the distance from the image view, which is exactly what we want. So we'll say we want this to be 40 units away from the image view. And it'll do it for us. And we also want this to be centered. So we'll add another horizontally in container constraint. Next, let's just do this description. We'll say we want this to be 20 units away from, again, the image view. And we also want this to be a certain distance away from the side of the screen so that it lines up with the image view. So if you remember, our image view is 60 from the left and 60 from the right. So we also want this to be 60 units away from the left of our screen. So we add those. And this one is just the same, but for the right side. So again, 20 units away from image view and 60 units away from the right. Now we can sort of mess with these guys down here. So you'll notice if I go into the constraints for this slider that it's going to say 255. Well, what is that 255 away from? And that's from the label. And so the reason for that is this is like messed up now because it's inside the image view. If we drag it down here and look at the constraints again, look, this changed to an 8. So now it automatically detects, oh, the top of this is 8 away from the image view. So we actually want this to be about 40 away from the image view. And we'll also center this, again, horizontally in container. We also want to extend it to these sides. So That's the same thing as image view. 60 away from both sides, and it'll stretch it for us. Set up the new score. 20 from the top, and we also want 60 from the left again. Then lastly, we have this button. You'll notice the button here is not just text, it also has a background. So to visualize that, I'll go ahead and add a background color. So there's our button. We want to stretch this, we'll say the same distance away from the sides as the image view again, so 60. Then we also want to set a distance away from the bottom of the screen. And 40, that's a good number, so we'll do that. And you'll also notice our button is pretty skinny, so to keep things simple, we're just going to give it a constant for a height. So to do that, we're going to go into here, check this little height box, and change that to your desired height, which in this case is 70. And there's our button. So now if we run this again, it's going to look the same, or relatively the same, on our iPhone XR. There we go. And you can't see this image view because there's no image there yet. All right, so that's sort of completes our view. We're not doing any styling just because we're focused on functionality whenever we're first starting with our application. So we've completed our view. We're now gonna start on our controller. So if you go in here, we have two things that sort of cause things to happen on the screen. We have this slider, and that's going to change the text that's displayed on new score. And we also have the button, and that's going to go and change essentially everything right here to something new. So we're going to need two functions that will do what these things are doing to the screen. So our first function, we'll call it update view. And we'll say this function is just going to update everything on the screen to match the next meme that we display. So updates the view. And then we also want a separate function that will update the score whenever our slider is moved. So we'll call this update new score. All right. And so we have these functions, right? I'm not going to write any code for them just yet because we haven't created any variables for any of these things, so we can't change them. So because we're working with storyboards and we're not hard coding anything, we're going to have to create these things called outlets. And what an outlet is essentially just a reference to a certain object in a storyboard. So the easiest way to do this is to click these little two circles. That opens up the assistant editor, and this allows us to see our view and then our controller at the same time. So clean that up a little bit. To create an outlet, you can either right-click and drag, or you can control-click and drag. and that creates a reference to our object in the storyboard. So we'll call this the image view, and that's our new variable that we can access everything that involves this image view. And we're just going to create outlets for everything. So again, control click and drag, or right click and drag. This is our title. This is going to be our name. This is our, we'll call it description. This is our score. Our new score. You'll notice when we get down to our slider, if we control click and drag this, we have this new thing called an action. And what an action does is it'll take, let's say whenever we move this slider, it's going to call this action. And so whatever we put inside this action, it's going to execute that code whenever we mess with the slider. So because we want an outlet first, we're going to click this right here and change it to an outlet. So we'll just call that slider. And same thing for the button. Because the button can do something, it's going to pop up as an action first. So we'll change that to an outlet, call that button. And then we also want the actions because we want to know if this stuff changed. So we can add an action, and we'll call it slider moved. And there's this type value right here. So just change that to UI slider, and I'll explain that in a second. Separate one for the button. All right, so what we did is we created references to everything that's on the screen, so we can access any of these as variables. We also created two actions. So whenever the slider is moved, whatever code is in here, inside of here, is going to execute. And same thing for the button. Whenever this button is tapped, this code is going to execute. So now that we have references, we can start changing stuff. But you'll notice this stuff is not available to us yet. We don't know what we want to display. So where do we get what we want to display? We get that from our model. So we're going to start creating our model class. And just this is where the files that you downloaded come into play. In the files you downloaded, there should be a meme.swift file. You want to drag and drop that into the model. So here's our meme.swift. Drag, drop into the model. Just yes. And then we also want, we'll go ahead and insert our images into here as well. So drag and drop these pictures into your assets.xcode assets. And this is just where you can put any media files that you have, like audio, pictures, stuff like that. Once you've done that, we're also going to create another model class. We'll call this one meme review, because that's going to be the bulk of what this application is. We're going to make this a struct and call it meme review. And we have a collection of memes that we're going to want to display. So what we're going to do is, we're going to create an array. And so we're going to create an array of memes. And this array is going to hold all the memes that we might want to display to our view. So you'll see we drag and drop that meme model class into our model folder. And this is the layout for each meme that we're going to use. And you'll sort of understand this after we code our meme review. But basically what we're going to say is we're going to create an array of memes and initialize it as an empty array of memes. And we're also going to have something to keep track of what meme is currently displayed. So arrays start at 0, so our current meme will be 0. Now, because we have private variables, we're going to need public functions to sort of get what these variables are. Now, we're never going to necessarily need to retrieve this array of memes, so we're not going to worry about it. But we are going to want to know, like, what is the current meme that's displayed. So create a public function called getCurrentMeme. And it's going to return a meme type.
Public.
Yeah, thank you for that. And right now we're just going to say return meme for now as a placeholder. We'll come back to that. So we have, just ignore this for now. We're going to want to add some memes to this. So what we can do is we're going to create a reference to our model class inside our controller. So if you remember our chart like this, there's these blue arrows between the controller and the model. That's essentially what we're doing here, is we're creating a connection to our model class. So let meme review equals a new meme review. And that creates that arrow, that connection to our model. Now, we don't have any memes yet, but we're going to initialize some memes. So in order to initialize a value inside of a struct or a class, we're going to start with init. And we're going to take in some parameters. So in this case, because we're creating memes, we're going to say, oh, what do you want the memes to be called? And we'll take in an array of strings. So what this is saying is, when we initialize our meme review structure, we're going to take in a parameter of names that's an array of strings. So you'll understand that more a little bit later, but what we want to do is, for each of these names, so for every name in this array of strings called names, we're going to add a new meme to this meme list array. So .append is like adding a value. So a new meme, we'll give it a name called name. So now, if we go back to our controller, we want to initialize it with memes so we can actually display stuff. So if we look at here, we have dos X. This is an array of strings. We have our drunk baby meme. Football, and we're just adding all these names. And that's it. So what we're saying is we're telling our model that these are the memes we want inside of our meme review. So the model is going to say, okay, we'll add these to our meme list and create memes with these names. And actually, you can see this is called dos X meme. And so because we don't want to type out meme after every single one of these, we're just going to say plus meme. So now we can start to sort of write these functions, because now we have some data that we can access. And we also have references to the stuff in the view that we want to change. These are our arrows to the view, and this is our arrow to the model. So this function right here runs as soon as the screen is loaded. And we're going to say as soon as the screen loads, we want our title to say meme review. And this is never going to change. It's always going to say meme review, so we don't need to change it in this update view. And we also want our button to say next meme. And this is just sort of how you set the text of a button for Xcode and Swift. You can't use .text because that just gets a value, you can't set it. So you have to call a specific function to set the title of it. And then these are the only things that are not going to change in our application. So when we click, everything changes except our next meme and our meme review. So for everything that changes, we're going to put in this update view function. So when we click next meme, we get the image of the meme, the name, the description, the score, and we also set this new score part and slider to the same value as the current score. So to do this, we'll create some references to the meme. So our meme that we're going to display is going to be retrieved from our meme review model class, and we're going to get the value of the current meme. What do we call this? Yeah. And this is probably where we should fix this function, right? So we're returning a meme, and we want to return the current meme. So to do that, that's pretty simple. You just accessed our list of memes, and we're saying we'll return the value of our current meme, which of course is the first one. To get the name of our meme, we'll do meme.getName. And this this dot get name is a function inside of our meme model. And you can sort of look at this when you get a chance, but we're basically, every meme is going to have a name, a score, a random score to be specific, and we're going to assign it a description based on its score. So we'll have functions to get the values of all of that. And we have our images in this folder right here, and they're all called the same thing as the actual meme name. So in Xcode, when you want to access an image like this, you're going to call the UI image class, and you're going to say, I want to get the image that's named the same thing as our meme name. So we declared our meme name as a variable called name. So we're going to find the image associated with this meme by its name. And so now we have all the information except for our description. And I called this get meme level. I should have called it get meme description, but that's just what it's called. And so we have everything that we want to display from our model class. And now we are going to tell our view to display this information. You'll notice this is all inside of the controller. This goes back to MVC. You don't want to communicate directly between the model and the view. You just want to use the controller for all that communication. So I'm going to change the name label to say the name of our meme. We're going to change the description label to be our description. We're going to change the score label to say this is our score plus the value of our score out of 10. And we also, that's right, you can't use this. In a lot of languages, you can use plus signs. I guess you still can. Can you use plus signs?
Well, score is
Yeah.
That was 2 dots. Is there a couple of dots?
So
you can do.
You can change this to a string, or you can use this sort of funny little syntax. So if you do a backslash and then open and close parentheses, we can put score in there, and it'll automatically convert score to a string. We'll say out of 10. We also want our image to change, image view, change the image to be our image. And we also want to change the position of this slider to be the value of the current score. So to do that, we do slider.value, and then we'll set it equal to our score. And value only takes in a float value, so we'll convert our integer to a float using this. And let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Notice if we run it, we get all this information for our first meme, which is Dos Equis, right here. But if we click our button, nothing is going to happen. If we move this, this isn't going to change, and that's because we haven't added that yet. So
So does this make sense?
Anyone have any questions so far?
All right, so we'll go to the update new score because we want to change this new score to say something. So to change it, we're going to say new score label dot text, and it's essentially the same thing as here, but we're changing it to the value of the slider. Now, if we put in, let's say, slider.value, it's going to display a float, and we don't want that. So we want it to display nice integers because floats can get really messy with lots of decimals. So to change it to an int, just cast it as an int. And we want this to be out of 10. And we'll call this inside of our update view function. So now when we run it, we'll notice that our new score now has a value. And you'll see it's 1 out of 10, but our score is 8 out of 10. So what's happening? This slider has minimum and maximum values. So right now, our minimum and maximum values are set at 0 and 1. So we want to change those to be between 0 and 10. So to do that, we'll go to our initial loading. We'll say slider dot maximum value equals 0, 10. Our minimum value is 0. So now when we run it, now our scores are accurate. But if we move our slider, our new score is still not going to change. And that's because we haven't added it to this action. If you remember, this action is called whenever the slider is moved. So whenever the slider is moved, we want to update this new score. So we'll run it again. And there we go. When we move it, the score changes to display accuracy. Now, the button. We want to update our view whenever this button is pressed. So we'll go ahead and add that in here. When our button is pressed, we want to update the view. If we do this, nothing's going to happen. And that's because we're not ever changing this current meme. So whenever we click the button, we don't want to just update the view. We want to go to the next meme and then update the view. So to do this, we're going to create a function inside of our model class. We'll say next meme. And what this is going to do is it's going to change our current meme by 1. Excuse me. Okay.
That's your current meme equals current meme plus 1. So that's equal.
It usually works. It might be because you have to initialize it.
It's struct.
Class. There we go. So that was the problem. We don't want to use a struct. we want to use a class because, yes. So when we call this function next meme, it's going to increment the value of current meme by 1. And so we want to call that when this button is tapped. So again, we're going to access this arrow to our model. So meme review dot next meme, and that's the name of our function that we just made in the model class.
Alright, just explain why you can use structs for that. Because when you create a struct, it doesn't create an object of the struct. Like when you initialize a class or something, it creates an object of the class, right? But when you use a struct, it basically just copies all that data from the struct. So there's no sense of self. Because it said self is undefined or something. Because self refers to an object of that class, but since structs don't create an object of the struct, it has no meaning. That's why you can't change the value of current meme.
So we'll go ahead and run this. And now when we press our button, the meme changes. We can also change this slider. But you'll notice if we keep clicking, oh no, error. So yeah, what this function that we created is obviously, it has no limit, so it's just every time we click the button, it's going to increment it by 1, and we could say, oh, the current meme is actually at 5,000, but we don't have 5,000 memes, we just have a certain amount. So to fix this, we'll just say if our current meme is equal to the number of memes in this list, we want to set it back to 0. And the reason it's not greater than this is because count is going to return the number in here, and because an array starts at 0, it's going to be 1 less than that number. So if we increment it and it's equal to the count, we want to say, oh, that's out of bounds, so set that back to the first meme. So now when we run it, it should be fixed. And there we go. Now, last but not least, go ahead and run it again. You'll notice right now we're on the Dos Equis meme. We want to change this score to, say, 10 out of 10. Now, if we do this, notice the score is still staying 3 out of 10. It's because we haven't added that functionality. So when we go to the next meme, we want to update the value of the meme that's currently being displayed before we go to the next meme. So we'll pass in an integer that's the value of our slider. And so we'll say slider value is a float, sorry. Before we go to the next meme, we'll update the score of the current meme. So we'll go meme list current meme dot set score. We need to cast it as an int new score. We'll go back to our controller and just add the value of our slider to this function. So we'll go ahead and run it. We'll change our score to 0 because this is a dead meme. We'll go back to it, now it's 0. And so that's basically it. The reason we didn't add all of this styling because that takes a little bit more time, and we're on a limited time frame. So I would encourage you to check out some of the styling. I'll actually go ahead and do the styling for this button right here to give you guys an idea of what it could look like. So create a new function. So we have rounded corners on this button, and we also see that the text is white. So to change the color of our text, we'll go ahead and do button.set title color, and we'll say dot white. And this little dot is just saying that go ahead and go back for a second. When we call this set title color, we see we need a UI color. And so when we say dot, we're saying, oh, this white is a member of UI color. So saying dot white is the same thing as saying UI color dot white. And this we'll just say dot normal because our button really doesn't change from normal. And to do rounded corners, we have to access the layer that this button is a part of and change the corner radius. And to get it perfectly rounded like this, we're going to do it to half of the height of the button, and our height of our button was 70, so 35. And if we call this in our load, it should work. And there we go. So that was sort of a basic introduction to the idea of model view controller and that design model. Remember, the controller should do most of the communication between your view and your model. And you never, generally speaking, you never want to have the model communicate directly with the view, because in large scale projects, that's going to be a nightmare to try and fix and debug.
Any questions?
Questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, so just a few things to note. Like how you said, the model should never directly communicate with the view. Let's say you don't have a storyboard, right? You make all these views programmatically. Let's say you had a file for a custom image. You don't want that image directly communicating with your model. You want it to go through the controller. And that's why also he made these functions private, because let's say you have multiple controllers, one is communicating with another. You don't want another controller like messing up the state of the first controller by doing like update new score when you don't want it to update. So that's why it's only accessible inside the controller and not from anything else. Same thing with the models, like the new files.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so we're going to have a meeting next week, and we're also going to be meeting in Marston.
Yeah, we'll be next Wednesday at 4.